The same courier, the same gate, the same hour for the 4th Tuesday running. That was the thing that broke my stillness before anything else did. My name is Corporal Aldous Ferris, and for 6 years I have stood post at the east postern of House Vantry after the palace gates lock for the night. I am not paid to notice patterns. I am paid to stand like stone, chin level, eyes forward, rifle at my shoulder while the great house sleeps behind me. But Stone remembers, and by the 4th Tuesday I knew something in that house was wrong. He came at 11:40, always on foot, always in a plain grey coat with the collar turned up, always carrying a slim leather folio under one arm like a man protecting it from rain that wasn't falling. He never rang the bell at the main house, never presented himself to the duty steward the way any legitimate caller would. He cut instead across the dark kitchen garden to the old groundskeeper's cottage at the far wall, knocked twice, waited, and was let in without a word exchanged that I could hear. 20 minutes later, near enough that I could set a watch by it, he left, empty-handed, no folio under his arm anymore. Whatever had been inside it stayed behind that cottage door. The groundskeeper's cottage belonged, on paper, to a household steward named Osric Thane, a quiet, precise man of perhaps 50 who had managed the estate's tenant accounts and outbuildings for 11 years, and whom nobody in the house had ever had cause to doubt. I had shaken his hand at the founders' dinner 2 winters running. He always thanked the guards by name when he passed the postern. That was precisely what made the 5th Tuesday different from the other 4. This time, as the courier crossed the garden toward that same familiar door, I heard a second set of footsteps behind him, lighter, hurried, unmistakably a woman's, and a voice, pitched low and shaking, that stopped him cold at the hedge line not 30 paces from my post. "Tell him I need more time." It was Duchess Wren Vantry, the young ward of the house, 23 years old, and as of 8 months ago when her father died of a failing heart, the sole heir to everything he had built across 4 decades of careful, quiet stewardship. She had come out in a plain coat thrown hastily over her night clothes, hair loose, feet in house slippers on the frost-hard garden path, no lady-in-waiting, no guard of her own choosing, alone in the dark reaching a stranger at her own garden wall. That is not a thing a duchess does unless every proper door in her own house has already failed her. I was 40 feet away, statue, still at my post as regulation demands, and I heard every word carried clean across the frozen air. "Time's the one thing Mr. Thane says you're out of, miss," the courier said, not unkindly, the way a man delivers bad news he has decided isn't his to feel guilty about. "He wants the transfer papers signed by Friday, or the letters go to the trustees' committee first thing Monday, and then to the papers after that, once the committee's finished with them. Your choice which order the world hears it in." "Those letters are lies," she said, and her voice cracked on the word lies in a way that told me it wasn't entirely a lie she was denying, or else she was simply terrified that nobody left in the world would believe her over a folder of paper with her father's handwriting on it. "Doesn't much matter whether they're lies once they're printed, miss," the courier said, already turning to go. "Friday. Signed and sealed, or it's done." He walked back out through the garden gate the way he'd come, folio empty again, and left the Duchess standing alone in the cold with both hands pressed hard over her mouth. I did not move. I want to be honest about that part, because it would be easy to tell this as a story where I stepped forward in that instant like some hero out of a play, rifle down, arms open. I did not. My post that night was the postern, not the garden path, and a guard who abandons his mark on instinct is a guard who has already failed the one discipline that makes him worth anything to the people who depend on him, standing exactly where he's told. So I stood. I watched her walk back inside with her shoulders still shaking, and the moment the relief guard, young Corporal Atwell, took the mark from me at 6 that morning, I did not go to my bunk to sleep off the cold. I went straight to my sergeant. Sergeant Ivo Draycott has run night security at House Vantry for 19 years, and he did not interrupt me once while I laid the whole of it out the 4 Tuesdays before, the folio going in full and coming out empty, and now the 5th Tuesday's conversation, word for word, because a guard's memory for exact speech is one of the only tools we're issued besides a rifle we are trained never to actually need. Draycott listened with his hands flat on the desk, and when I finished he sat back and said one sentence that told me he had already, quietly, half-suspected something himself. "Thane's been requesting the old estate ledgers from archive for going on 3 months now. Told the archivist it was for a routine tenant audit. I never thought to ask him twice." We went to the archive together before breakfast, boots still cold from the yard. The request log, kept in the archivist's careful hand, showed Thane had pulled records tied specifically to the Duchess's late father's private trust, old correspondence, an unsigned codicil nobody had thought worth filing formally, and a thin folder of letters between her father and a woman named Elspeth Carrow that had never once, in 11 years of tenancy, been part of any official estate file Thane had any lawful business touching. Draycott didn't so much as lay a finger on the shelves. He photographed the request log exactly as it stood, then walked us both straight to the master of the household, a stern, exacting woman named Corinne Blackwood, who had run the affairs of House Vantry for 18 years and did not tolerate being brought half a story. I told her everything I had heard at the hedge line twice through, because she asked me to repeat the courier's exact words a second time and wrote them down herself in a small, hard hand. Miss Carrow was the old Duke's ward before his daughter was ever born, Blackwood said quietly, mostly to herself, staring at her own handwriting rather than at either of us. There were always whispers below stairs that he'd meant to provide for her properly in the will and simply never finished the paperwork before his heart gave out. If Thane has found some way to dress up an old, unfinished kindness as a scandal. She stopped herself mid-sentence, jaw tightening like a fist. Friday. That gives us 2 days, Sergeant. Not 1 hour more. Here is where the story could easily have ended quietly, the way past mysteries in this house have ended, a private memo written, a resignation quietly accepted, the truth settled behind closed doors. But Blackwood made a decision that morning that changed the shape of everything that followed. She did not warn Thane that anyone knew. She let Friday come exactly as he expected it to. On Friday at 11:40, I was posted at the East Postern precisely as always, nothing in my bearing to suggest the night was any different, except that this time Draycott had 2 additional men positioned in the garden shadow behind the old apple trees, and Blackwood herself was waiting inside the cottage's neighboring tool shed with a household solicitor and a constable, having obtained, on the strength of the archive log and my own witnessed account, a lawful warrant that same afternoon. The courier came on schedule, grey coat, collar up, folio under his arm exactly as always. He crossed the garden without hurrying, the way a man walks when he believes himself unobserved. He knocked twice on the cottage door. Thane opened it, and this time I did not stay statue, still at 40 feet watching it happen the way I had 5 times before. My orders that night, given personally by Draycott that afternoon, were explicit. The moment the folio changed hands inside and the Duchess's signature was called for, I was to move to the garden gate, close it behind the courier when he came back through, and hold the ground until the others arrived. A guard is not meant to invent justice on his own authority. But a guard can be handed a lawful order to stand exactly where a door needs to be blocked, and that is precisely what I meant to do. 6 minutes later, the cottage door opened again, faster than the 20-minute rhythm I'd watched for 5 weeks. Thane stepped out first, already talking fast to someone behind him, a folder of loose papers gripped in one hand, the transfer documents still unsigned because the Duchess inside had refused one final time, which was precisely what Blackwood had gambled she would do if she believed for one more evening that no one else knew what was being asked of her. Thane took 2 steps into the garden and saw the tool shed door swing open, saw Blackwood and the solicitor and the constable step out into the low garden light, and understood in one visible, whole-body second exactly how badly his Friday had gone. He ran for the garden gate. I was already standing in it. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this house and this uniform do not deal in spectacle for its own sake. I did not strike him. I did not need to. I stepped fully into the gate's frame, planted my boots, and said 4 words, no more. Stand where you are. Thane is not a fighter. He pulled up 2 feet short of me, chest heaving, breath fogging in the cold, and looked at the wall of a man in a red tunic who had not moved an inch and plainly did not intend to move one more. The constable took him gently from behind, calm as any Tuesday, and read him his rights in a flat, unhurried voice, while Thane's shoulders sagged like something had finally let go inside him. The courier, caught between the cottage and the gate with an empty folio and no honest explanation for either, sat down heavily on the garden bench without being told to and put his head in his hands, saying nothing at all until a second constable arrived to take his statement. The letters, it turned out once the solicitor read the whole file that night by lamplight, were never a scandal at all, not in the way Thane had spent months carefully building them to look. Elspeth Carrow had been the old Duke's ward as a girl, taken in after her own parents died in a coaching accident, raised alongside the Vantry household as something close to a second daughter, and provided for informally for years afterward out of simple, unpublicized decency. The Duke had begun, and genuinely never finished, a codicil formally acknowledging a small trust in her name, entirely unrelated to anything Thane's carefully doctored cover letter had been written to imply. Thane had spent 3 months quietly rewriting the framing around otherwise genuine documents, altering dates by a season here and there, inserting suggestive language into his own summary notes rather than the letters themselves, preparing to leak a story about a hidden family disgrace that existed nowhere except inside his own editing. If the frightened, grieving Duchess had signed her inheritance into a protective trust, administered, conveniently and quietly, by Thane himself, the forged narrative would simply never have needed to survive being tested by anyone. It was blackmail built entirely out of paperwork, aimed with real precision at a young woman with no father left alive to advise her and a household staff she wasn't yet sure, 8 months into her grief, that she was even allowed to trust. I did not learn any of that from proximity to power or from any cleverness of my own. I learned it from standing still in the cold on 4 ordinary Tuesdays and refusing to let a pattern go unremarked on the 5th. That, in the end, is the whole of what a guard's discipline is actually worth. Not the rifle we never fire, not the tunic or the medals or the bearskin, but the plain refusal to stop noticing what passes in front of a post night after night. The Duchess came to the East postern herself 2 mornings later, without an escort. I had not expected that, and no regulation I have ever studied covers what a guard does when the head of the house he serves stops directly in front of him and simply stands there, unsure how to begin. She was not in morning clothes anymore. She wore a plain green coat, her hair properly done, and she looked, for the first time since I had watched her cross that frozen garden in her night clothes, like a woman who had actually slept. "Sergeant Draycott told me it was you who noticed," she said, "the Tuesdays." "It's the post, miss," I said. "I only stand where I'm told and watch what passes." "You could have stood there for a month and said nothing at all," she said, something almost angry in it, though not at me. "Most men would have decided it wasn't their business." I did not have a clever answer ready for that, so I gave her the true one instead. "It became my business the night you came out to that hedge line in your night clothes and asked a stranger for more time, miss. A man can unsee a folio. He can't unhear that." She nodded slowly at that, and something in her shoulders loosened that had been locked tight. I realized only then, since long before I'd first seen her cross that garden, perhaps since her father's funeral 8 months earlier. She did not offer me a medal, and I confess I would have been uneasy accepting one for simply doing what the post required of me. The household did something instead that I have come, in the weeks since, to value rather more. Blackwood formally revised the East Postern's night rounds so that the far garden wall, the blind stretch nearest the old cottage that no rota had ever properly covered, was written permanently into the post's watch, passed down now to whoever stands that mark after me. Thane's name was struck from every household document by the end of that week. His cottage was reassigned within days. His access to the estate's records was revoked before the sun had even set on his arrest. The county magistracy charged him with fraud and attempted extortion, and the case, when it reached a courtroom that spring, moved quickly, since the archive log and the warrant left little room for argument. The Courier, who had no real stake in the scheme beyond a weekly payment he badly needed, testified fully against Thane and in the end avoided the worst of what might otherwise have come to him. Elspeth Carrow, contacted quietly by the family's solicitor, received at last the small trust her father figure had always meant her to have decades late, but finally settled, completed by the Duchess's own signature on the very codicil her father had left unfinished when he died. None of it made the evening broadcasts the way a slap or a shove at the palace gates so often does. There was no crowd of tourists filming a confrontation, no clip shared 1,000,000 times by dusk. It was, in the end, simply a guard noticing that a folio came and went empty-handed on the same 4 Tuesdays running, and refusing to let the pattern pass unspoken on the 5th. But I have stood a great many posts in 6 years, and I have never once felt the true weight of this uniform the way I felt it walking back to my bunk that Friday night, knowing a young woman with no one else standing between her and a manufactured disgrace would finally sleep without that fear pressing on her chest. I still take the East Postern most nights, same hour, same mark, same stillness the post has always demanded. I still watch the garden wall the way I was trained to watch anything of importance, without ever appearing to watch it at all. Thane is gone, his name spoken now only as a caution to junior guards during their first briefing on the estate's boundaries. The cottage has a new groundskeeper these days, an old retired soldier named Purdy who waves at me most mornings, and has never once asked why the far wall gets an extra pass every hour on my watch now, written into the rota as though it had always been there. He doesn't need to know why. That part of the story belongs to the post itself now, the way all the quiet ones eventually do, folded into the discipline, carried forward by whoever stands here next, long after the men who actually lived it have moved on to other gates.